Welcome, everybody, to Dear Asian Americans. I'm your host, Jerry Wan. Wherever you are, maybe, whenever you may be listening to this, we wish you health, we wish you safety, and we wish you happiness. It's an interesting time right now that we're living through. We're recording this in the middle of April. And as we all have experienced by now, life is a little bit different. And as much as we talk about life going back to normal, um, normal isn't going to be what we ever imagined it to be. Life moves on, the world evolves, we all evolve, the world changes. And for those of you that are listening that were born stateside or have spent most of your lives here, um, what we're going through right now, and we're thinking, oh my God, this is crazy. We're being asked to do so much and live a new normal. Think about what our parents went through. Um, Many of us come from families who decided to move here. And many of us are children of parents who had no choice but to move here just so that they could live. And we were plopped into communities that we were not familiar with. I myself, we were lucky to move to a city called Fullerton that still had a pretty strong Korean population when we moved in 1992. Um, yes, there was a little bit of prejudice and judgment, but I didn't feel alone at school. But for some of us, through the sponsorship program or through placement programs that the United States government provided in the 70s, which was an amazing program and so grateful that it existed. Some of the downside was that families were being asked to live in areas that were so literally foreign that people didn't even know the names of the countries that we were from. And so my guest today lived that life, growing up in rural Pennsylvania, um, and recently wrote a book to tell that story of his coming of age story as the child of Vietnamese refugees. Title of that book is Sigh Gone, which phonetically sounds like the city, but it's actually the word sigh, comma, gone, which I think is one of the coolest book titles I've ever seen in my life. Um, so with that, Phuc Tran, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Jerry. Thanks for having me.
You know, I didn't plan to start this podcast in the pandemic. Neither did you plan to release your book during the pandemic.
It's
Perhaps the
tough,
upside is that both of our audiences have slightly more time on their hands
for
to
sure.
read a book more than they otherwise would have, or to
Yeah.
listen to a podcast more than they otherwise would have. But one thing for sure is that it's given us a lot of time to introspect about what it means to be of this world, a community wherever we may live in, and really our place as Asians in America, Asian Americans, Vietnamese, Korean,
hmm
because what we're going through. It's no secret by now that we have seen far too many instances of being treated still other and the perpetual foreigner of never really feeling alone. Um, with that in mind, even if we went back to our quote unquote home countries or our birthplaces, would we feel at home there? I don't know. Tough to say, but
hmm
this is our home. I'm in California. You're in Maine. Could not be further apart in the contiguous United States.
Yeah.
But thanks to this time and thanks to technology, here we are having this conversation. I want to learn about Fuke in the earlier years. I alluded to it earlier in the introduction, but tell us a little bit about the journey here to America for the Tran family. How did it happen? Under what circumstances? And where did you end up living?
Sure. I was born in Saigon, Vietnam, so now Ho Chi Minh City, and my grandparents worked for the U.S. Embassy there, and so I mean, that was like their Willy Wonka golden ticket, right? Like when it all started falling apart, they were part of that initial 130,000 Vietnamese that the United States decided it was important to evacuate, which I think like the U.S. government is and has done problematic things, and questionable things, but I think about that decision, for Gerald Ford to think, oh, there are 130,000 people who were our allies, and if we just bail on them, like they will just be dragged to a ditch and shot. So my family, my grandparents were, they were given birth to, on a car, to get out on some sort of transportation. Um, and so they rounded up. I can't imagine what it was like to pick 12 people, they had a huge network of family members, and I don't know what kind of heart-wrenching process they went through to be like, okay, it's not like a kickball team, right? Where you're just like, okay, you 12, you guys are coming with us. Everyone else, good luck, but that's what happened. So yeah, we were all like 12 of us, my mom, me, and my dad. We were all like lined up to get on a bus to an airfield. We got on the bus, but I was crying so much that my grandmother was like, she was kind of embarrassed, and she was like, you know what, like let's get the next bus. This is not good, like with the little Phuc crying. And so we got off the bus, and then as that bus pulled away, it got hit by mortar fire, like it blew up. Everybody on that bus died. And then we got on the next bus and then pieced out. Yeah, it was wild. And so basically that journey, we kind of like hop skipped across the Pacific, like Guam, Wake, and then the U.S. government had set up 4 relocation camps for Vietnamese refugees, specifically in Camp Pendleton in California. There was one in Arkansas, one in Florida, I think, and then one in Pennsylvania. And so we ended up in Pennsylvania. This is actually, interesting in the process of, reading a little bit about the the government's policy. There was actually specific federal government policy that was intended to keep Vietnamese from living together, because they didn't want them to turn into these sort of ethnic enclaves. Um, and so the Vietnamese population that came here were specifically just spread all over the U.S., like literally, like the real diaspora. And so we were sponsored by this nice, group of Lutheran families, who came and sponsored our family of 12. And we moved to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is just like a small working class town in South Central PA, near like about half an hour from Harrisburg. So that's where we grew up. And, we were like the first Vietnamese family to roll in there. It's funny. I was talking to the Vietnamese writer, Viet Thanh Nguyen, and he was like, "Why didn't you guys leave?" And I was like, I have no idea why, because I mean, like you think about it now, right? You're like, oh, Orange County, it's like literally like a million Vietnamese people there. But there wasn't any internet. It was like the late '70s, so it's like, if your whole sort of nucleus of 12, your family is there, like no one's gonna tell you like, hey, you know what? There's like a ton of Vietnamese people in California or, Northern Virginia or Dallas or whatever. Um, and so, yeah, so we just all stayed. Yeah,
You are here through sheer luck. Your
totally.
entire family. So if anybody ever gives you crap about crying, that's puts it in perspective, right? It's just
Yeah,
it's wild. Your family is also here of great fortune based on your grandparents' employment with the U.S. Embassy, of just being on the right side, literally at the right time.
total
But
luck.
also,
Yeah.
yeah, it's wild. Just the percentages and the probabilities of everything that needed to happen. What because of the fact that your family was able to move and live in America thanks to a chain of generosity points, whether through the government or from, like you said, your sponsor. The gratitude towards America and your identity towards what Americans were. How was that discussion, or how was that formed early in your life?
Mm. Yeah, so that's such an interesting question, Jerry. I think like my parents were always incredibly grateful. Like and rightly so, right? They were just like, we owe these people our lives, like very literally. And so um you know baked into that meant that we couldn't, there was no room for any kind of critique or critical conversation about like, yeah, sure, they saved our lives, but you know what, they're also part of this like systematic racism or this, that, or the other. You know what I mean? Like it just like, as you, I think probably is true in, for our parents generation, like they always wanted to appear grateful,
Right.
and never seem ungrateful. And I think they're highly aware of the power dynamic, right, in this country. We're not like, so like you're there to like appease white people, so don't make them angry and don't like make them think that you're anything other than incredibly grateful. And I think part, and rightly so, like they're acutely aware of that easy come, easy go, right?
Mm,
Like that at 1 minute, you can have a plate full of food in front of you, and the
right.
next minute, like it can be gone. So that was hard for me growing up because as a teenager in America, right, like you're raised to be a critical thinker and you're raised to like ask hard questions, or at least I thought I was, and my parents were just like, were not interested in that at all. Any kind of line of critical inquiry.
Right. And the other side of it is fascinating. I am not, a white person who grew up in America. I was on the other side, right? On the receiving end of comments and whatnot. But it's, this doesn't condone it, but it's understandable why certain Americans looked at us differently, with almost this arrogant look of, you're only here because of our collective generosity.
Hmm.
Therefore, fall in line, do as we say. We know better than you, and
Hmm.
we're not even going to give you the respect or the decency to learn about you because you were somebody that needed saving, and only mighty America could have done so. Particularly in a community like Carlisle, Pennsylvania, that was not as diverse as
Hmm.
Los Angeles or New York City or any other big city. And
Hmm.
as you said, it was the 80s. There was no internet.
Yeah.
You had
Yeah. No, definitely not. Right.
three sources of news, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
you know, it's fascinating. Growing up there, did it get more diverse as you got older, or were you always the one kid? And how did that affect your friendships growing up?
Yeah, it did a little bit, I think. I mean, we there was the Army War College there, so there were military families that would come through. I was the only Asian kid in my class till I mean, probably till at least eighth or ninth grade, maybe. Like, I'd have to go through my yearbook to think, but that, definitely through eighth grade, definitely through eighth grade. Like in my grade, I was like the only Asian kid, and then I think like once you hit high school, like more kids were coming in. So, but it was also like at that point, it was like the late '80s, so like there was like a second wave of like Vietnamese immigrants, and also like just people, moving to Carlisle. There was a black population, a small black population in Carlisle, and then very few Hispanic kids, maybe like one or two, maybe, and it was, I think the town demographically was in the, I couldn't find the statistics for that specific era, but I think it was like in the high 80%, like 80 whatever percent white, maybe, or you know, so pretty white. I mean, whiter than sort of the national demographic, right? It's like I think white people are like 60 something percent, but
Yeah.
yeah,
And there's a point in your life, that you mentioned in a book, that was pivotal in your self awareness and confidence building, as you alluded to, the power of words from both a negative perspective, because there's so much hatred that can be carried and displayed by simple singular word, that kids who spew it out don't even know what it actually means. But also the power of words to enact great positive change and to inspire and to, I mean, you wrote a book and we have a podcast. We believe in the power of words.
for
Um,
sure.
when did you share with us that story, and when did you believe that your words actually mattered in this world?
Yeah, I think for so long, like I just felt like my story wasn't interesting or important to anybody, and the two things happened. One is that my family, I think generationally and also culturally, they were like corporal punishment was just the norm, like any like parents, grandparents, cousins, uncles, like they just would like just smack the shit out of you,
Hmm.
and nobody turned to, nobody really was like thought any that it was aberrant behavior. And then my second grade teacher sort of like caught wind of this, because like my dad just like really like beat me up pretty bad one day, and like I couldn't sit down in school, like I couldn't sit in my chair, like it hurt so bad. And my teacher found out about it, and in my mind I was just like, well, like, is she gonna like fight my dad? Because that's gonna be like super weird. And like, but she just came and she like, yeah, she like had a conversation with my dad, and then my dad like stopped beating us. And I was just like, holy smokes, like you can like just talk to somebody. And like that was the first moment where I was like, oh, like, you can use words and that can stop physical violence. Because, like, in your mind as a kid, you're just like, it's like, it feels Darwinian, right? Like, that only someone bigger and
Right.
stronger than my dad could stop him. And so that really clicked. And that same year, I wrote this like goofy story for Thanksgiving, the Thanksgiving writing contest. And I was like, there's, like, look at, and I remember it was like a story about like, what are you grateful for? And I'm watching all my classmates, like drawing these little pictures of like, like houses and vacations and things like that. And I was just like, and I didn't know that at the time. I wrote the story about how I was grateful that my grandparents got here
Mm.
from Vietnam safely and it won the contest. And I was like, wait, what? Like I thought again, like I thought it was just like this like kind of one-upsmanship, like whoever writes about the coolest thing is going to win the contest. But for whatever reason, so those two things were really pivotal for me in being like, oh, like words are powerful and we have to act accordingly, right? Yeah.
But it was also, which was crazy. I mean, because looking at it now and knowing what we know about life, as slightly older folks, obviously, it's that matters. Screw a vacation, right? Like screw a toy.
Yeah, for sure.
It's family and those memories and that human connection. And then perhaps that's what your teachers and your administrators at your elementary school saw and said,
Mm.
here's a kid that's mature far beyond his age unknowingly, because for him, it's family. Because if you grew up in America as, a non-immigrant, non-refugee, it's no big deal. Grandma and grandpa are down the street or in a town
Hmm.
or state over. So that's amazing. You decided to continue your love of words and continue your love of language, and studied something in college that most people, any people of Asian American, very few, I can't name a single one. Share with us, I guess, backing up a little bit to high school, of when did you
Yeah.
discover that field of study? How did you fall in love with it? And going to Bard College,
Yeah.
how did you decide that was a thing that you're going to
Sure.
major in?
Yeah, yeah. So I kind of I left high school and I had this deep love of literature. And then, concurrently I loved art. And I thought that I was going to double major in art and English when I went off to Bard. And when I got there, I'm going to be euphemistic here and be polite, but I didn't connect with my classmates. Like I was in English class and I was in art class, and I was looking around, and like I think in my mind I had built up like the college experience to be like, I'm gonna meet my people, like finally, like I'm gonna find my tribe, and these people are gonna like love books and art as much as I do, and we're gonna connect. And it was really quite the opposite. Like within like 3 months, I was like so depressed. I was like, oh, like I want to drop out. Like it just didn't. There was no way that it was so built up in my mind. Having sort of escaped Carlisle, that there was, in retrospect, I recognized that nothing could have lived up to what I thought I wanted or was going to have. And so, I was sitting there, like it was like first semester, my freshman year, and I was just like, oh God, like, feeling just so disappointed because I'd like built up what, being a double major in art and English was going to look like. And it didn't look like that at all. Um, and I heard this kid talking about taking ancient Greek, and he was just like, he was complaining about it. He was like, oh my God, it's killing me. It's like the hardest thing I've ever done. And I think I might have like oppositional defiance disorder or something, because I heard that and like my ears perked up. I was like, what's that? I want, like, you know what I mean? Like it was
Yeah.
like, okay, whatever. It's like, this is the hardest. I was like, okay, it's like, oh my God, it's the spiciest thing I've ever eaten. I'm like, shit, give me
Try it.
that. I
Yeah.
want to try that. Yeah.
Level
So
10, whatever level 10 is,
so
bring
like,
it.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I'm always trying to level. I'd rather fail, you know what I mean,
If you're gonna
in
go
trying to
big, go
level up.
big. Why not?
Totally. Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. Um, so I signed up for ancient Greek, and I would like, it killed me. I mean, it really, like, literally, like I went into Greek not where, like, I didn't have corrective eyewear, and like I studied so hard, like I literally like went blind. Like at the end of freshman year, I was like, oh my God, everything's blurry, I can't see, and I had to get glasses, and it was hilarious, but I loved it. It was literally like the hardest thing I'd ever studied, and but I had a real aptitude for it, and it was like a small department, and like the professor was cool, the kids were fine, like my cohort of peers in that department were great. So I just was like, yep, I'm switching over to classics, classical languages and literature. So I did Greek that first year, and then I actually went and did Sanskrit my second year, like
Wow.
concurrently, and then I did Latin, and then I minored in German. Because my plan was to go to grad school in Germany. So I was like, well, shit, I got to learn German. So I like did German immersion. It was wild. Yeah. So I just kept like piling on the languages. I mean, you're kind of like on a roll at that point, like where you're like, all right, just bring it on. Yeah. My parents were like, what, my grandmother, especially, cause like when I was like, oh, I'm learning Latin, she was like, what are you going to like be a priest? I was like, no. She's like, are you going to be an exorcist? I was like, no. um, I don't know. I was kind of in the moment. I definitely did not have a plan. And then I went to grad school, um, and then moved to New York City and taught Latin in high school. Yeah.
I guess that was my next question, or I guess most people are wondering, like, what do you do with that education, right? Because it's not,
Yeah.
um, I mean, thank you, capitalism. We live in a world where
Yeah.
arts, particularly classics, not often or highly rewarded in a capitalistic society, other than go teach other people the same
Yeah.
thing, which is
For sure.
the
It's like
value
a
add.
Ponzi scheme. It's a total Ponzi scheme.
It's not a very big one either, not a very
No,
profitable
no,
one.
definitely not.
No,
No, no, no, no.
shrinking
Small
pyramid.
market share. Yeah,
Um,
small market share.
um, let's talk geography because you spent the very many of your years in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and as we
Yep.
discussed, not very diverse.
Nope.
Bard College, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is in upstate New York, literally on the Hudson in a city called Annandale on Hudson, close to West Point. Um,
Mhm.
not the diversity capital of the world either.
Mhm.
And then eventually down to New York City, where it is literally the most diverse place in the universe. Um,
Mhm.
talk to me about your feeling of belongingness in those three different places as you progress through life.
Yeah. I think yeah, it's such an interesting question. I think in Carlisle, it, and I'll say this for what it is, and I think I mean, the U.S. is still predominantly white, and obviously, like demographers are watching that shift a little bit. But I think it's for me at least, it's such an important survival skill to
Mhm.
navigate whiteness. I was actually talking to one of my white friends, and I was just like, it's like I I have like a PhD in navigating whiteness. You know what I mean? Like and like because that's what you do to survive, right? I mean, it's
Yeah,
kind of like it's like when you realize that like there's like kind of like it's like code switching, right? Like I mean, that's like a
oh yeah.
newish or like within the last like 15 to 20 years. But I mean, like everybody was doing it before. I
Mhm.
mean, like black culture knows how to code switch. Like black culture knows how to talk to white people, and then they know how to talk at the barber shop. And like Asian people do the same thing
We
you
literally
know,
call it
um
white voice and white light, right? Like, you know, you're hanging out with your friends and then your work calls you and you're like,
Right,
it's
right.
instinct and we don't even know we're doing it.
That's
But if
right, that's right.
somebody's
You
looking
learn
at you,
it.
they're like, what
That's
the
right.
heck? Why do you talk like that?
Yeah,
You know,
totally, totally. I'd never heard
it's
that before.
wild.
Yeah, so I think, like, I was really I mean, for better or for worse, like, I'm very comfortable around white people, and I mean, just because that was the environment that I grew up in and the schools that I went to,
Yeah.
even at Bard, in fact, like, New York, I was just like, "Holy shit," like, it's, like, just every kind of person, like, ever, you know what I mean? It was kind of amazing, I loved it, and when we left New York to go to Maine, which is the second whitest, state in the country. Like a lot of my New York friends were like, "Are you like nervous?" And I was like, Psh, I was like, "I'm just like going back to the mothership." You know what I mean? Like I don't like I'm just back to square one. It's totally fine. And then it's I mean, we have pockets of we have like ethnic restaurants here and stuff like that, and that's fine. And honestly, like I miss the food is more important to me, frankly, than it's like with technology now, and it's like it's easier to connect with people and find people in your cohort, or if you need sort of a place of community. Like that's easier to find, sort of on the internet or just
Yeah.
even on the phone or texting a friend, because like let's face it. I mean, like, like if I want like a good banh mi or pho or whatever, it's like you can't get that on the internet. Like I need that in town. But yeah, it's yeah,
You've lived your entire life in this world of expression. You found this gift that your words mattered, turning a negative into a positive in second grade, at a very early age. Then you went to really the root of all words and studied languages and classics that define a lot of what we believe and philosophize about. Um, and then you also found, if you're watching the video and not listening to the audio, you see on his arms tattoos, which is another form of expression, through artwork and through however you define it, because there's no rules in tattooing. Um, was there a point, was there a singular moment that kind of sparked your interest in getting tattoos? And when was the first time you got one yourself and then decided to apprentice to learn how to then give other people tattoos?
sure, yeah. So tattooing was like always a huge part of like that punk subculture.
Mm.
But it costs money, and I mean, like I didn't have any money in high school to spend on tattoos. Like there was this like guy in our town or 2 towns over, and he did tattoos, but they were really bad, and he would actually do it for trade. Like, you could bring him a toaster oven, and he would tattoo you for it, and I was like, "No." I was like, I'm not going for that." Um, so, a bunch of my friends were getting tattoos, but I was like, I think I'm gonna wait till, like, 1, I have money, and 2, like, the guy is better, and, so I got tattooed at Bard. There were, like, these, like, traveling tattoo guys that rolled through, and I was like, "You know what? Like, I can get a cash advance on this like emergency credit card that my dad gave me. It was like literally like, if you need to get an appendectomy, use this credit card, and I was like, cash advance, I'm getting a tattoo,
Oh
and
man.
yeah, so I got tattooed by these guys, and then I just struck up a friendship with one of them, and we stayed in. He was from New York City, and then we stayed in touch, and then I would travel to New York to get tattooed by him, and then in my last year of grad school, he sent, this is like pre-internet. He like called me, and he was like, "Hey, listen, the shop that I'm working at is going to look for an apprentice. You should apply."
Huh.
And I was like, "Okay." He's like, "You're like super into tattoos, and you're getting heavily tattooed. Why don't you look into it?" So like, I drew up this
Yeah.
portfolio and I mailed it. I mailed it to New York City, and then I got the call 2 weeks later from the owner. He's like, "Hey, I looked at your drawings. Looks pretty good. Move to New York City and learn how to tattoo." And I was like, "Yep, I just got to get my master's, and I'll be there in like 2 weeks." And
Oh, very cool.
yeah. And I was like, and it was unpaid.
Yeah.
So I was like, "Do you mind if I like work during the day teaching Latin, and then I'll just show up at like 3 p.m. and then I'll just work till like 10 at night?" He's like, "No, I don't care. I'm just like tattooing. They're like
Yeah.
pirates." So yeah, I just did that, and I mean, they didn't care that like I had this weird,
Yeah.
teaching gig, because I mean, the shop would like open at like noon anyway, so it's like I rolled in at 3 and I
Yeah.
would just work till like 10 at night.
What was that like? Because I mean, you didn't quite live a double life, but you taught high school students during the day
Mm,
in a more
yeah,
quote unquote, I don't know, more respectable profession, and I say that
for sure.
with a pinch of salt there. And then you did your passion job, right? Like,
Right, right, right.
um, was that, which part of the equation did you enjoy, because you absolutely love the classics and teaching students brings us joy that is incomparable,
Hmm.
yet you were finding your own artistic craft, and by learning and observing and just being around through just osmosis and just being there, um, did you think that you would actually have to make a decision at one point or another of picking one or the other?
Yeah, I didn't yeah, I mean, I guess, if I it never came to that. Yeah, it never came to a head like in that way. Like for whatever reason, the things that did fall apart were like, my like relationship with my girlfriend. Like it was literally, I mean, obviously that was, if she hears this podcast, I'm really sorry. But like it was like this trifecta of things, right? It's like I'm like working during the day and I'm working at night, and I like I'm living with my girlfriend, and like I guess I made the choice,
Right.
right? Or she made it for me, and it wasn't as explicit as like you got to pick a job and spend more time with me, but it was
Mm,
just like things like the wheels were falling off
yeah.
anyway. And so I was, like, so no one told me that I had to pick either of the jobs,
Right.
and so I
Interesting.
don't
Okay.
know. Yeah,
Very
yeah,
cool.
yeah.
And at some point, you decided to move away from New York City and even further up the eastern seaboard into Maine. And what was the motivation for that? And and you mentioned earlier your comfort in because this is home for you. Really, it's just a different kind of Carlisle, Pennsylvania.
Mhm,
Um,
yeah, for sure.
but having lived in New York City, at the most diverse place in the universe,
Yeah, yeah.
and then you mentioned your friends were like, "Oh my god, are you scared to go back?" But like, what went through your mind of, I have the opportunity to go get the bomb ass bowl of pho or to get whatever I want as a comfort food, and then
Yeah, yeah,
actively
yeah.
decide, "No, I'm gonna go live in a place where I don't even
It's
know what that
flannel and
is."
lobsters.
Yeah,
Yeah, it was a quality of life decision, and it wasn't, just around, fun, but me. It was like, I mean, it's like it's a grind living in New York, like
yeah,
you're running to stand still. And my wife and I kind of looked at each other and we're like, like it would be great to like own a home, and it
yeah,
would be great to open up our own business and have kids. And I just couldn't wrap my brain around raising my kids in New York City. It felt daunting to me. And so we did a couple of visits to. My wife is from Maine, and so I just thought, yeah, I'll live in Portland. I mean, it
yeah,
seems great, and people are nice, and so I wasn't too worried about it.
okay,
It's like I dealt with so much sort of like overt brutal racism, growing up, that like I I feel like I can pretty much handle anything else, and it won't be, how bad could it be? No, seriously,
sure,
you know what I mean? Like it's like
yeah,
when like you've had it real bad, like where people are trying to like beat you up. I was like,
yeah,
and also it's a different world now, right? Like I mean,
yeah,
the 2000s, 21st century racism it's there, but it's not like it was in the 80s.
sure. Well, the 2020 version of racism is also ugly, but we'll get to that
For
maybe
sure, for
later.
sure. Yeah,
Which
yeah, yeah.
different? It's I think you mentioned a story about what you could possibly get away with, and that being the motivator at times of people deciding to do something or not, and that plays a large role in perpetrators of racism and hate crimes of what they generally think that they can get away with based on their perception of its social acceptability, um, which I think is what's driving a lot of the hate crimes today. Um, but I want to talk about the thing and that moment that led to you 11 years later um, being a writer, because it
Mm.
was in 2009, if I'm getting my uh, dates right, that you decided to audition or submit a interest form to speak at a local TEDx conference
Yeah,
in your home
2012.
state.
Yeah.
2012. Okay.
Yep. Yep,
Um,
yep, yep, yep.
what was the point? I guess what was the moment that you decided that you wanted to share anything at all? And what was then the process of selecting a topic, because to get selected for a TEDx, and even though these are all locally organized, the selection process is pretty similar in that it needs to be a theme and the
Mhm.
timing, and just it's not an easy thing to get, even though there are
Mm,
more locally organized events around the world. Um, Take us through that process of, hey, I think I got a cool story that I want to share, and what was that topic?
sure. Yeah, so, in 2012, a friend of mine, um, just called me and he was like, "I think I'm gonna nominate you to speak at the TEDx conference that's coming up." And I was like, "Okay." He's like, "Is that okay?" And I was like, "Sure." And he's like, and I was like, I just was like, "You know what? Uh, they might not even pick me. I don't know. And it's fine. I'm busy." And so I got the email and they're like, "Would you come and, what's your pitch?" And so I just thought, because I was teaching Latin, and Greek, and I was like, like I want to talk about like languages and grammar. I was kind of vague because I wasn't really like, I just was I just didn't, it was like half baked. And they were
Yeah.
like, "Oh, that sounds interesting." And I think like they're on the surface of it, superficially, they were just like, "Oh, like a Vietnamese guy who wants to talk about like grammar, like that's kind of hilarious, right?" So they brought me in and they were like, and I got the email. I was like, "Oh shit! Oh, I guess I got to think of something to say." So I pitched him the idea of like, growing up speaking Vietnamese and knowing English, and sort of like and really being in conversation with my dad and sort of talking about the disconnect that I had with my dad, and how it felt like some of it at least was based in the language,
Huh.
and like they were into it. So I gave the talk, and then during the coaching process, the TEDx coaches and the organization have this refrain. They say, "This is the talk of your life." Like this is the talk of your life. Like they just say it to you over and over again. And I think that the organization was trying to impress upon you how much they wanted you to prepare, right? Like they don't want you to get up there and like have it be a shit show. So like they really wanted you to bring it. But I thought about like that refrain, and I really took it like to the next level, and I was like, okay, this is the talk of my life. Like I'm going to take like all the Venn diagrams of my life that I've always compartmentalized
Yeah.
and just like smush it all together. Like I'm going to talk about in 12 minutes, right? Like no pressure.
Right.
So I was like, I'm going to talk about being Vietnamese, being a refugee, growing up in Carlisle, being, bilingual. I'm going to talk about Star Wars. I'm going to talk about, like Latin and Greek. Like just, it was like kind of like, it was like this like mashup, like, the DJ Girl Talk. It was like literally like the girl talk version of my life, where just like everything was colliding. And I was like, and I just thought I'd go for broke, because again, it's like go big, and the response to it was like really overwhelming, and like my talk got picked up by NPR, and people were just, I was like, really, like that's a thing, people like it. I just couldn't believe it, and that's when like the seed was planted in my brain for like, oh, like maybe I have a book in me.
There's a a hidden gem in your TEDx story that took me a little bit of digging to sort of see the brilliance in it. What was the name of the TEDx
Oh, Dark
conference?
Side of the Subjunctive. Oh, Villages. Yeah.
Was it
Yeah, it's
Villages?
called TEDx.
Okay.
Yeah, oh, TEDxDirigo is the main, or locally organized TEDx conference. Yep,
And
yep.
Dirigo is a Latin word
Latin.
for
Yeah. I
I
lead. Yeah.
direct,
Yeah, I direct.
I
Yep.
lead, which
Yeah.
is to me beautiful because that was the symbolic time that you decided to write your own story,
Mm,
to direct your own production that's now a book, but also
mm,
the seed that was planted for you to you've always known your story mattered, but did it matter to the point that you needed to write a book and share it with the whole world? I think is, you know, nobody goes from zero to writing a book overnight, right? There's a
no,
process
for sure.
of
For sure.
trial and error and self-doubt and imposter syndrome and oh
Yeah.
my god, all these things.
Yeah, yeah.
And then nobody certainly unless you were already of fame and influence, and then you just put that attention against it. People don't write bestsellers off the top of anything. It's just something
Mm,
that you work towards. So it's been a journey for you to get there. And like you said, you were interviewed on NPR by Guy Raz, and then that's somebody
mhm,
whose name, if you're in the podcasting, any fandoms, like is a household name. And and so um, before we talk about your actual journey of writing the book,
mhm.
you mentioned something, the two words that are special to your life, in a number of different ways, and it's Star Wars. Um,
Cue the music.
Cue the music. We'll do the rising
The
logo, the
scroll,
word,
yeah,
the
right.
scroll. Maybe we'll air this episode on May 4th. I don't know. Maybe.
Oh, can only hope.
How did Star Wars come into your life? And given the relationship with Star Wars that you use now in your social media handles and some of your publicly facing handle, or I guess identity,
Mm,
uh,
mhm, mhm.
share with us when Star Wars came into your life and why it was so cool to you then, and how it has helped form your identity, your own unique Vietnamese American identity.
Mm. I mean, as a child of the late '70s, right? Sort of like solidly in that Gen X demographic, like Star Wars is, like it's, sort of our cultural bread and butter. Like we're all, or that, we all sit at the table of Star Wars, right? To some degree, if you're of that certain generation. And like for me, like at least as a, obviously it's like cool as shit because it's like lasers and
Yeah.
Wookiees and stuff like that. So like just as a little kid, you're just like, oh my God, it's like the greatest thing I've ever seen. And it was always like the common denominator for me on the playground,
Mm.
like it's like no matter what our differences were, like we could always agree that we could play Star Wars, and then like, okay, now we can like stop bullying you, or like now we won't shut you out because we need a stormtrooper to shoot. Okay, Fook, you be the stormtrooper, we're gonna shoot you. I'm like, sweet, all right, I get to play, or whatever. So yeah, so for me, like it was always my love of Star Wars is obviously like it's primal in like the lasers and aliens and stuff, but also like it felt really connective, and like it was a place where I could find community and like a sense of belonging, um, in a very real way. So yeah, I forgot
No, but
what was.
it also helped you, uh because when we transfer, not translate, but introduce our cultural names into
Mm,
what is arguably an American dialect,
for sure.
our names are romanized versions of how it is really written. In the Vietnamese language, it's even more interesting because letters are still used, but they
Hmm.
actually literally have different sounds. Um,
Hmm.
so when we have our American friends, or just English based friends who read our names, or given names written in English, uh,
Hmm.
they don't know how to pronounce it. They
Yeah.
it's funny, like, oh, Tchaikovsky, no problem. Mike Krzyzewski, no problem. And they're like, but what?
Yeah. Right. Right. Right.
Especially,
Right.
like Vietnamese names have, written in pronunciation is so delicate, and
Yeah.
there's a way to get
It's
it
a big
right.
gap.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
tell me how the particular character in Star Wars, Luke Skywalker, helped not only help your friends pronounce your name, but now have taken on this, I guess, tangential yet concurrent identity for you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, my sort of social media hand. I mean, I've always sort of introduced myself as Phuc, right? Rhymes with Luke, and yeah, and so like my handles now are all like Phuc Skywalker because it sort of helps people navigate, their way into figuring out how to pronounce my name. Because like it's not, fuck Skywalker. It doesn't sound very cool, or it sounds really angry, right? And then I mean, I think like he's like the for me, like, prior to reading like let's say like Mark Twain or JD Salinger, like he was
Yeah.
the original like disaffected small town boy.
Mm.
Like he like really like I watched Star Wars and I was like, "Oh, he lives on like a redneck planet. Like he wants to get the fuck out of there." I was like, "Me too."
Yeah.
Like and I really connected to the emotionality of it. Like for me, I think because I grew up in like a small all white town, like I think
Yeah.
like the racialized piece just didn't even blip on my radar. I was
One of
like,
the
I don't
father
care if he's
issues
not
too. We talked. Yeah.
white. Yeah, totally
I'm like,
right. Yeah,
really?
yeah.
That's my dad?
And
Shit.
yeah, totally. And that too. Yeah. No, I mean that's so huge. It's a really very astute observation. But I think my source of conflict was really like, yeah, it was like doubling down, right? It's like, oh, like, well, at least in the first Star Wars when you didn't know who his dad was, I was like, I want to get out of Carlisle. Like Carlisle was like literally like felt like Tatooine to me for sure. So I identified very strongly with Luke.
That's crazy. Man, I hopefully one day soon, not hopefully, one day soon, we'll get together and talk about this for hours on it because I think it's
For
so
sure.
much there.
Yeah, get your brother in. I want to talk to your brother too.
Yeah, Jay, if you're listening, you might have found a bigger Star Wars fan than you, who actually right now,
Soulmate, soulmate.
um, him and his wife recently moved to State College, for
Oh, no
yeah,
shit.
yeah, for
Oh
her for
god,
her position
that's
at Penn State. So
oh boy. Yeah, yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah.
I don't
I
know.
know that place
Maybe
well.
you can
Yeah.
trade. I don't know. There's Go to that one place. It's got that one really cool thing. It's I think uh, one of the things that would have been impossible, truly impossible, maybe improbable, but I would dare say impossible for our parents to imagine what we would have made of their sacrifice of coming to this country, while their um, two main priorities were acceptance and survival. maybe in the reverse order: survival first and acceptance. Um,
For sure.
is for any of us to dare so greatly and audaciously to create artwork, to
Mm.
create pieces of literature,
And to have
um,
it be like a living, right?
and have it be a living, but also
Have a
more,
job.
absolutely, but more important than anything, which is our story, right?
Yeah,
This is not
yeah.
writing Star Wars about some mythical stuff that you made up in your head. The fact that we can write, and you've demonstrated by writing Sigh Gone, that you can take the thing that actually was such a point of pain and shame and suffering and just something that many people who've gone through that journey maybe often would like to forget, and what became of that sacrifice in your own journey growing up in this country is a book that once you publish a book, it doesn't go anywhere, right? This
Mm,
isn't, it's not the internet, but books never go away.
mhm,
You've put something into the universe that I genuinely believe will be so healing and therapeutic and tears of joy um and I'm not saying this to hype you up. I'm saying
oh,
this
no,
because
thanks, man.
it's
No, I
true.
really
It's
feel
absolutely
I'm
true
really touched.
because
No, thank you.
it's true because we are living at what I consider the tip of the iceberg of the golden age of Asian Americans saying, finally, my story effing matters. And I'm going to find whatever medium is comfortable to me, whether it is a podcast or a blog or an Instagram account, or
Mm,
dare greatly and go to the institution that is American publishing
mm,
and go behind that castle, go into that castle and say, I have an American story that needs to be heard. And
mm,
then to get pieces of validation from media. Um, New York Times reviewed a book this week, and it was your book. And slight jab to Sopan if you're listening. Sorry, they didn't review the book
Lo
of the guy who works for the paper.
love
Uh,
you, Sopan.
me too. Sopan introduced Phuc to me and said, "Hey, there was another Asian
Uh,
American book," and I joked back. He texted me, and I said, "Well, they're not going to review two Asian books in a week, so we got to do with what we can."
Oh god, yeah.
But it's and the subtitle, it's a misfits memoir of great books, punk rock, and the fight to fit in, which it may not be punk rock, it may have not been great books, but we certainly in our own way fought to fit in. You tell very, very vivid stories of your childhood and adolescence in this book. um, so I want to know what actually, after the MP, or actually the TEDx talk, after
Mm,
the rounds of interviews and media that you got, and the confidence and the perspective that it gave you to
mhm,
even dare to write a book. Um,
mhm.
and then what were some of the first things that you did in trying to recreate or recollect some of the early childhood memories? Because that's not easy to think about something that happened 30, 40 years ago.
Sure. So after the TEDx talk, yeah, which the reception was, far beyond anything that I could have anticipated. Locally here, some people just started approaching me to do like live storytelling events, like
Mm,
moth style things, and they were small, like audiences of like 50 people, 70 people, and um, if you haven't figured this out, I'm kind of a masochist. I'm like, oh shit, that's really scary. Speaking in front of people, super scary. Like
do
telling
it.
like a deeply personal story. I was like, yep, I'm doing that. Like it's that scene in like Goodwill Hunting where he talks about how his dad comes home to beat him and he's like always choose the wrench. It's a dark scene, but I'm that guy too. I'm just like, yep, whatever's terrible, I'm gonna do that. So I just was like, yeah, gauntlet thrown. Like I'm gonna do live storytelling. I'm gonna tell real stories from the stage, and so I for a couple of years I did like live storytelling events. And honestly, like Jerry, like the thing that really got me into a place to be able to tell my story was like therapy. Like
Mm,
when I found out that I was gonna have kids or a kid first. I really thought hard about like what kind of a parent I was going to be.
Mm.
And I realized that just saying I'm gonna do the opposite of what my parents did is not a rule for parenting.
No.
That's just, like, reactionary, you know what I mean? Like, it's
Right.
just, like, oppositional. So I, like, went to counseling, and I was, like, dug really deep and, like, healed some stuff and, made peace with some stuff so that I could talk about it and not feel angry or, enraged or cry. I mean, like, in public, and it draw whatever wisdom and insight that I could from it. So really, like, big shout out to therapy. And I think, like, all joking aside, like, I think the Asian American community, Vietnamese community, I don't want to speak for all Asians, or I'll speak for my family. They are not great at talking about their experiences. They're not great about talking about their feelings. They're not great about processing stuff. And for like, I think it's integral to having a healthy relationship. And
Yeah.
you know, God, if nothing else, like, I hope people can can go to counseling and like seek help. You know what I mean? Like,
Hmm.
I think it's so critical. And I know that there have been news bits about like mental health, especially in the Asian community, and how it doesn't get as much traction
Yeah.
for whatever reason. Like, maybe it's like a cultural thing where people feel ashamed and they're like,
Yeah.
oh, I don't want to like seem like the crazy person who needs help, or like we just sweep it under the rug. And like, but there's, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I'm not sure. But that was really critical for me. Like, even more than the TEDx talk
Yeah.
or the live storytelling stuff was like, or maybe in tandem, right? Maybe both of
Sure.
those things. Like going to counseling and like sort of like working through my shit was like really just so clutch. Yeah, and then I was approached by a literary agent, who was
Mm.
like, "Hey, are you interested in writing memoir?" And I was like, "I saw your." This was like in 2016. So she was like, "I'm 4 years late to the game, but I just saw your TED talk and I love it. And are you interested in writing memoir?" And I was right at that point, like in my brain, kind of being like, like when I'm retired, like, and I'm 60 and I like have nothing to do, like
Yeah.
I'll write a book. Why not? But then it just kind of like, again, luck. It's like getting off the wrong bus. Like it just
Crazy.
happened at the right time. Um,
But if
like
she
I'm always no, go ahead. Go
if
ahead.
she contacted you in 2012, you would not have been ready to write a book. Not this one,
No,
actually.
no,
Maybe a different
no.
book, but not this one.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It's just luck. And I think it's part of the American myth that we love to think that like people are scrappy and like if there's success, it's sort of self-made, and like that this like kind of like personal manifest destiny, because we love that, like
Yeah. It's a good story.
and
And
yeah,
it
it's a
makes it
good
achievable.
story. Totally, because
Right.
then also if people fail, we can blame them,
Sure.
right? Like, there's personal
Right.
accountability. But I just wanna name how many times in my life I've been so lucky. Like, I'm
Mhm.
just in the right place at the right time, and I can take no responsibility for that, or, like, no credit. I can't take credit
Yeah.
for it. Obviously, like, I could be in a position where she's like, "Do you wanna write a book?" And I send her a writing sample, and she's like, "This sucks." And
Right.
cool, like, that was the end of the
Yeah.
story. But, like, I wrote a thing, and she read it, she's like, "This is actually really good." And I was like, "Okay, let's do it," But that, you know, luck, maybe, I don't know.
And in the process to uh, write, in the process of finding what to write about,
Mm,
um, what kind of conversations did you have with your parents, if you did,
mhm,
your brother,
yep,
and
yep.
people from various stages of your upbringing that helped you get perspective and clarity on how to write about that so many decades later?
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of things that I had talked about in therapy, excuse me. So that, and honestly, like it's not like in any given calendar year in the memoir, there's maybe only like 3 or 4 events that
Right.
happen, and those were still very fresh in my
Mm.
mind. They generally, there's like kind of like funny stories and then like sad stories, right? So it's like they're kind of interspersed. So it's like, even like for like, I don't know, like 1982, it's not like a detailed account
Sure.
of like a week by week thing. It's
Yeah.
just like, here are 3 stories that happened in 1982. I talked to my parents mostly just to get like certain details right. Like that was important to me. And I checked in with my brother a couple times, like, oh, do you remember this happening? In the interest of the memoir, like some timelines had to be compressed just for the sake
Hmm.
of the narrative. And like probably like the biggest thing that happened, that like in terms of a time shift that's like not like historically accurate, is like I had to move like there's just one chapter that was too long,
Yeah.
and I had to move an event from that chapter to the
Yeah.
following chapter, you know? So it's like if you ask me like, "Oh, did this happen?" I'd be like,
Yeah.
"Yeah, it absolutely happened. It just didn't happen in
Yeah.
that year." And that's just because the chapter was just too long.
Sure. Um, one of the things that I'm curious about as I was reading it, and it's something that we all grew up with. You mentioned it earlier in the interview, which is corporal punishment, right? Like
Mm,
just getting the shit kicked out of you,
yeah,
physically
yeah,
sometimes, or like getting
yeah,
stuff
yeah, yeah,
thrown at you.
yeah,
Um, you talked about kneeling on a bed of rice, which makes your
yeah.
knees
Did you
very
guys do that?
painful. I did the keep your arm parallel to the ground, and we're going to put a phone book on it.
Oh, yeah, 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 yeah,
Or it
yeah.
was
Yeah.
do the plank. Before planking was an exercise, planking was a form of
Oh
punishment.
god, god,
Um,
that's weird.
yeah,
Wow.
it was just like, we're gonna make you suffer, but we're not gonna give you any scars to prove
Yeah,
yourself, right?
yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
it's just
yeah,
invisible scars. Um,
yeah.
we, and then maybe like most of our Asian American listeners are like, oh shit, I remember, and then people are thinking about
Yeah,
like
yeah,
how they were
yeah,
reprimanded,
yeah,
and then maybe our uh, non-Asian friends were like, they get away with that? You should have called the
yeah,
cops. And you're
right.
like, that's not the way it
Right,
works, dude.
right,
That's
right,
not the way it works.
right.
Um,
Yeah.
you talked about it openly in the book,
Mm.
and how was that received? Talked about feedback from family, because it's something that might have been, probably is something that nobody's really ever proud of.
Nope, my parents have not read the book, so I'll
Interesting.
let you know.
Okay,
My brother
come
yeah,
back
my
and tell
brother
me.
yeah, my brother is the only family member that's read it,
Okay.
I just think, one of the I on my writing notebook, I taped a thing to it, and it said, "The thing that you're afraid to write, write that."
Oh, beautiful.
Um, I take no credit for it. I found it like on the internet, and I was like, "Oh shit!" It's like Oscar Wilde says, "Talent borrows, but genius steals." So I just like I printed it out and I taped it to my notebook, and I just, like anytime I needed to like have the balls to write something that felt
Yeah.
scary, I was like, "Yeah, like you gotta." I don't want to read. I didn't want to read a memoir. I didn't want
Mm.
people to read a memoir that didn't take risks.
Oh,
And I
sure.
didn't do it and I didn't wanna do it in a mean way, like, I think if I just wanted to tell the truth as long as it warranted it. It's like, I don't want my parents to feel like I have an axe to grind, like, I hope
Yeah.
that, when they read it, they can just be like, "Oh, we're complicated people." Like, Phuc is complicated, I'm complicated, our
Right.
history is complicated. It's not all, like, rainbows and unicorns, as you
Yeah.
said before. But it's also not like Charles Dickens where, like, I grew up and, my parents did the best they could, right? I
Yeah.
mean,
But they all
and
did.
sometimes yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
And yet we also have to name what they did, right?
Sure.
So, like, that's the complexity of
Yeah.
it, right? Yeah.
Um, one of the coolest things that I think an author can do today, especially today in 2020, is to do the audiobook, which then
Mm,
puts so much more. I enjoy listening to books more than reading it myself, because actually, distinction. I'll only do the audiobook if the author reads it, and I'll read the paper book
mm.
if somebody else reads it, because that plays a critical role in how I receive the story. Because you feel the emotion, you feel the excitement, you feel the sadness as the person who wrote the words and actually gets to personify it audibly to you. Um, Take us through that process. Was it just reading words? Was it?
Oh my god, it was so savage. Oh, so savage. My yeah, I wish someone had warned me about it. It was really hard. Um, because like you have to enunciate. So like I'm in a recording studio in Portland, and like they have like a direct connection to New York digitally. My producer, Maddie Argyropoulos, she works for Macmillan Audio, is on my headphones, and she's listening to the live feed as I'm recording, and then there's an engineer in another room. Um, and so it's like performative, but like she wants you to kind of slow down. Like the hardest thing for me was the enunciation. Like you don't realize how kind of sloppy or or lazy your pronunciation can be. So like, I wrote words that like I really regret writing, like sixth, or dude, breasts, like reading the word, saying the word breasts, for spoiler alert to your audience. I talk about breasts, and like she's like, "Oh, I didn't hear the T," because like, if you're talking fast, you're just like, "Oh, breasts," with no T. So it was like just brutal stuff like that. Yeah, like I probably every paragraph I had to back up and re-record it. So we did like 100 pages a day. So it was like 9 to 5, just like grinding.
Uh,
And like read like I maybe had like one stretch where I read half a page where I didn't have to redo something. It was like it was savage. It was really hard. But I'm glad you're listening. Does it sound terrible?
no, no, it's amazing, and look, I'm telling, especially memoirs, right?
So brutal.
Um, I mean, I don't know why people write memoirs and have somebody else narrate it for them because
Yeah, for
you're
sure.
letting somebody else take ownership of telling the story.
Yeah.
So I mean, so you wrote the book over the course of many years, and then you let it sit. Obviously, the press process, the publishing process takes some time.
Mhm.
Um, what were you most hopeful for on Tuesday when the book finally dropped?
Um, I I guess I'm just excited for people to read it. Like I think up until Tuesday, well, I mean, up until like they started doing the giveaways online, maybe a dozen people had read it, and it's complicated because you write a book and you want people to read it, and then you write it, and then like no one's read it. Like my wife has obviously read it like a whole lot, and my editor and my agent, but like and it feels good to get feedback, right? Like and to share your story with people, right? It's kind of like, being a musician and only playing in your bathroom or your bedroom, like it's like at some point you got to get out there. Like you want to
Yeah,
see what kind of an impact it has. So I guess I just am excited for people to read it um, and hopefully they have a, reaction with it, right? That
yeah,
there's like some magic that happens if they read it. That would be great,
sure. I do
Uh,
think there's. I'm feeling the magic. I felt the magic.
thanks, thanks, buddy.
No,
Thanks.
it's Um, and to give the audience context, it was the day after I recorded with Sopan, um, and he texted me and he said, "Hey, did you hear about this book?" I said, "No, I actually don't know every single Asian that book comes out. That's I
Yeah,
would
me
love
neither.
to." We don't have a platform that maybe we'll have to create one ourselves, right? And so I
Right, right.
read the description and I was like, "Holy crap! I have to get him on my show." Because I wanted to learn. Because
Mm,
those of us who came in the 70s and 80s and 90s are now old enough to have the confidence that our stories matter, and we
mm,
have the it's confidence. Everything else is an excuse, right? Oh,
mm,
money, access. You can publish your own books on Amazon for free, right? Like, or the
mhm.
internet, just
Yeah,
write on Instagram. There's no,
for
it's
sure.
just getting
Right.
to that point of making the decision to. Um, and it's not anything to related with the show, but just as a person who has a similar background, if we as a collective community don't get behind 100% our brothers and sisters who've made the scariest decision of their lives to tell their immigrant story, and we don't go support it, then I'm sorry, you don't believe in telling immigrant stories. You don't.
I
And look,
appreciate you saying
and some things that have become crystal clear to me and very humbling to me as I've this is now like the 40th episode or conversation I've had is I was blind. My blind spot was kids of refugees.
that.
Um, yeah, it's a shame we don't hear about the story in school. Obviously, it's not something that American school systems teach us.
Mm, mm,
But I was even blinded by my own privilege of having, a family
mm,
that chose to come here
mm,
and not looking at stories, looking for stories written by our Cambodian, Vietnamese, Lao brothers and sisters that were like, dude,
for sure.
I'm not here by choice, but I'm finally getting to share it.
Yeah.
And so we talk about children and we talk about what do we want them to read, not later,
Mhm,
now.
mm,
What kind of world do we want to not only bring them into, but grow into as well,
mm.
and not have um, the refugee stories be something of a historical context of it's before my time. I don't know.
Yeah.
And nobody
And
lived to
also
tell about it.
yeah, and also, like, I think, this is like, I feel like the book kind of covers terrain that hasn't been covered in the refugee story, right? Like, I feel like the narrative, at least in sort of dominant white culture, is like, they struggled so hard and, like, they were on a fishing boat adrift at sea and, like, this, that, and the other, and then they got to America, pull the curtains and then roll the credits, right?
Yep.
Like, they got here happily ever after, and it's like they got here and then, like, shit was still super complicated and, like,
It's not
like,
easy.
so no, exactly, and so, I felt like that was my story, like, that it my story isn't my parents' story, right? Like, my
Sure.
parents' story is theirs to tell, it's
Hmm.
not I don't have permission to tell that story in as much as, I am a part of it, but, like, growing up in PA, like and that was a big disconnect too, right? Is
Yeah.
like, my parents are like, "You know what we went through?" And I was like, "I don't," but, like, it's also, like, I don't have a context for it, like,
Right.
but also, you know what? Like, study hall in 7th period sucks too, you know?
Right. Right. Getting
Um,
right. Being all the childhood memories that are uncomfortable that we can, some of us can laugh about it now.
yeah,
And we just have to put out as much positive identifying content out there so that whether it's our kids, our literal kids, or their generation, or somebody in college, or a friend of yours and mine that has never really thought
yeah,
about leading into our born identities to storytell. Um,
yeah.
Share with us one bit of advice or perspective to somebody who right now knows that they want to share, that they know exactly what they should share, but they're afraid for a host of reasons.
Mm, gosh. Um, I think, um there's a great quote from Oscar Wilde, and he says, selfishness is not living your life the way you want to live. Selfishness is asking someone else to live the way that you want them to live. Um, so so don't feel bad if you are living your life the way that you want to live, and that means doing the things that you need to do. And it's, as opposed to the life that your parents or your community
Mm,
expects you to live. Like, that's true to me, like, that's true selfishness, right? Like, you need to do X, Y, and Z because those are my expectations of you. It's like, wait, what? Like, so yeah. So I think,
awesome.
yeah.
Thank you for one writing the book. Um,
Oh, thanks
and
for reading it, Jerry.
look,
Thank
it's
you.
and we'll do we did a different version, but well, let's try something fun. I don't know when we're going to upload this, but if you're
Sure, sure.
listening, if you're listening to this, and I can't ever say when it's done, but first three people to DM me and Fuke at the same time on what your favorite part of this interview was, we'll send you a book. I'll send you a book,
Thanks, Jerry.
and we'll figure out a way to Fuke to sign it because
Yeah.
that way it's real. Uh, we end the it's and one for writing the book, but two,
Oh, thanks, buddy.
sharing about it, right? Because one, every work, every book, every show, every interview, every little bit um, nudges all of us as a community together to a collective point of yes, not only uh, yes we can was immortalized 12 years ago during the campaign, um, but I think even more important than that, before we can, um, we have to realize that yes we are, and
Mm,
that we are who we are. We cannot change the past. We cannot change the past of our home countries and the wars that they fought or the things that our
mm,
parents went through. But we have to realize that, yes, we are proud of where we come from, that, yes, we are going to then tell everybody what our story is. And that, as you mentioned, many of us carry multiple PhDs in whiteness and how to um, assimilate, which is a
mhm,
word that we grew up with now that I fundamentally don't believe is the right way to live life here.
mhm.
Um, and so I believe, genuinely believe, your book will inspire countless people. Maybe reading that book won't be the thing that gets them to write on their own, but it certainly will move them closer to that place that makes them feel comfortable that it was all along. And as we alluded to, um, right now might not be your time to tell the story. People often have shared with me, like, you love talking to people, you ask great questions, like, why now? I said, I don't know why now, but if I started this, let's assume podcasts were available when I was 22, makes
Mm,
for a different conversation. I don't have
mhm,
the additional 14 years of life
mhm,
to ask the fun stuff and to share at on the same level. So everybody has their time. Um, a lot of it is luck. You're here through a series of literal split second decisions that,
for
um,
sure.
and now we have to then make the most of it, right?
Mhm,
Make the most of our parents and grandparents, sacrifice, and not be ashamed of anything that they've done. But as you mentioned,
mhm,
call them out on their shit. Um,
mhm.
you can do both. You can be
Yeah,
thankful and wishfully thinking it might have been a little bit different and less
yeah,
abusive, and that's okay. um,
yeah, absolutely.
um,
Yeah.
Phuc, thank you again. We end the show in the
Oh,
same
great, thank
way.
you.
We end the show the same way. Going back to the title of the show, Dear Asian Americans, as we've talked about, this entire conversation is letting each other know that it's okay. It's okay to feel, it's okay to experience, and it's okay to verbalize and share those thoughts. And so, would love for you to help finish out the show and share anything you'd like with the greater Asian American community by
Mm.
completing the letter, Dear Asian Americans.
Dear Asian Americans, we are complicated. We are so many things. I think about the words of Walt Whitman and his poem Song of Myself. And he says, do I contradict myself? So then I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. Um, and so do you. You contain multitudes.
Thank you. Um, First time somebody's quoted Walt Whitman in the letter portion, but I think given what you've spent years studying, it's only appropriate that you drop classical bombs of quotes as we close out the show. Fuke, thank you so much. This has
Oh,
been
Jerry, thanks. That was great.
no look. I So many of us, and I don't- I hope it doesn't sound like I'm belaboring the point, but um, many of us read books because we're forced to growing up,
Hmm.
right? What's on the syllabus? What is the reading list? What is
Yeah.
available? And then we sort of stop reading when we grow up. And then maybe we pick up a book because it has tactical tips for us to do something better at our jobs.
Hmm.
And we get busy with life. And rarely do we ever get a chance to read books for fun.
Yeah.
And even when we do, we lean towards stories like Star Wars and other
Hmm.
fun things that are more
Yeah,
culturally
for sure.
relevant. Um,
Yep.
but I hope that people who are listening to this take the time, and it doesn't have to be Fuchs' book. I hope it is
Hmm.
because it's beautifully written and I think it's an amazing
Oh,
story.
thanks.
But go read
Yeah.
Sopan's book. Go read,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
anybody's book that looks like you, that resonates with you, because your story will resonate with somebody who's a child of a refugee far more than me.
Hmm.
Like, it's gotten me emotional, but I can't imagine what it does to somebody whose parents actually lived it.
Hmm.
And different stories hit me different than it would you, and that's
For
okay.
sure.
We're not a
Yeah.
monolith. We get it.
Exactly. Yeah.
But we
We're a
have
multitude.
we are a multitude. But if you put
Yeah.
all the Venn diagrams together, there's a giant overlap, and that's
Yeah.
us being Asian American,
Yep.
being treated differently, feeling like the perpetual model minority outsider. And in this moment of COVID-19 related stupid hate crimes, anti-Asian sentiment, and just even feeling even more so out of place in this country that we call home, that is our home.
Hmm.
Uh, Stories like yours really make people feel um, like we can dream of an America that we want to be. So,
Hmm.
thanks, man. I look forward to the day that we can celebrate in person.
Yeah. Thanks.
I don't know what the midpoint of Portland, Maine, and LA is, but let's not meet there. Um,
My parents live
we'll
on the West Coast. I'll let you know.
Well,
Yeah.
let's go to Orange County and go
Yeah.
hang out.
Yeah. Boba
I
tea.
that's I grew up there, so yeah, eat some pho, drink some boba, and we'll have
That
a
sounds
blast,
great.
man. Thank you so
Awesome.
much.
Hey, thank you, Jerry. Yeah.
Best of luck to you in the coming
Thanks.
weeks. Go buy
Yeah.
the
Absolutely.
book. Email us, DM us if you want to win one of these books, and best of luck. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take
Thanks,
care.
Jerry.